The Battle of Nomonhan, also known as Kalkungul, between the Russians and the Japanese decided the outcome of World War II. The battle started with a cavalry clash in the disputed zone between Mongolia and Manchuria, which is northeast China. The Japanese won this battle, but then the Russians came back with a larger force and won this skirmish. And this started an undeclared war called the Battle of Nomonhan. The Russian attack force outstood the Japanese strike force, which made the Soviet plans a reality. One of the main causes that led this battle to end the way it did is the artillery of the Russians, which was more advanced than the artillery of the Japanese. The biggest difference was that the Soviet tanks had a bigger barrel, which led to higher accuracy, and the Soviet tanks were faster, while the Japanese tanks were slower and had a smaller barrel, which led to poorer accuracy. This battle affected World War II by giving Adolf Hitler the confidence to make an alliance with the Soviet Union, allowing them to attack Poland and France, in turn starting World War II. Also, it made Japan attack Pearl Harbor instead of Russia due to fear of Nomonhan Part 2, and this brought the USA into the war and let the Allies to win the victory. But with World War II came a lot of loss of life and the tragic declination of the Jews, but fascism came to an end with World War II. Germany was triumphant throughout the war because of Nomonhan, which gave Germany the clear to attack Poland. Then, with the momentum of the battle, they attacked. In 1941, when the Nazis were pushing the Japanese to invade the Soviet Union from the east, the Japanese rejected this because they were worried that they would face defeat again, so they instead bombed the USA, which got America into the Second World War. But through all this tragedy, there still was triumph. This was that the Russians regained triumphant among fascist Germany and the Imperial Japan. Also, Nomonhan got the USA into the war, which secured the Allied victory. The Battle of Nomonhan made this possible by giving Adolf Hitler the confidence to declare World War II and attempt to create the Aryan race, but failed because the strong countries that were affected by the invasion of Nomonhan came together to stop the fascist country of Germany and the imperial country of Japan.
Stuart Goldman, he's the leading authority in this subject. He wrote a book on this subject, and it was nominated for the Military History Book of the Year.
All right, how did this conflict start?
The conflict started as a seemingly unimportant little border skirmish between Mongolian and Manchurian cavalry border troops. Mongolia and Manchuria are neighbors, but Manchuria had been conquered and completely taken over by Japan. Mongolia, at that time, was the only other communist country in the world that was allied with the Soviet Union. The Japanese decided that they needed to support their Manchurian allies, and so they sent a whole regiment in to smash the Mongolians on the border. But the Soviet Russians saw them coming, so they sent a regiment of Soviet troops in to support their Mongolian allies. So what started as a seemingly unimportant little border skirmish in some remote and godforsaken part of the world grew into a big fight between Japan and the Soviet Union.
What were important attributes that led this war to end how it did?
Well, the way this war played out was, at the beginning, the Japanese thought they had a big advantage because they had a railway line that ran only 50 miles from the combat zone. And so they could bring in thousands of troops and guns and supplies. The closest railway line that the Russians could use was 400 miles from the combat zone. But the Russians brought in 4,000 trucks, and they ran this day and night truck shuttle, bringing in thousands of tons of equipment and thousands of soldiers, and most important, hundreds of tanks. The Japanese only had a small number of tanks, and their tanks were crummy. The Japanese kept escalating the fight, but the Russians matched them time after time. And when the final showdown came, the Russians had 500 tanks in the battlefield, and they just rolled over the Japanese and annihilated them.
Why was this conflict so important?
This seemingly obscure border clash on the Mongolian-Manchurian border actually played an important part in the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. The Germans were determined to attack Poland. England and France were sworn to defend Poland. Germany was allied with Japan. The Germans wanted to make sure that if they fought against Poland and England and France, they didn't also have to fight Russia. And so the British and French were trying to bring Russia in as an ally against Germany. The Germans were trying to make a deal with Russia so that Russia would not participate in the war. Because the Russians had this Japanese problem, the Russians decided to sign the alliance with Germany. So that gave Hitler the green light to invade Poland, and that's how the Second World War began, leaving the Soviet Union out of it. So the Russians weren't fighting in Europe, so they could turn around and smash the Japanese at Nomonhan, which is exactly what they did.
How come such few people haven't heard about this conflict?
The reason why this battle is so little known in the West is because, first, the battlefield is in a really remote and hard-to-reach area. There were hardly any newspapermen there, there were no reporters, there were no journalists, there were very few observers. Also, the world's attention was focused on Poland because Germany was about to attack Poland, and everyone understood that that's where the war was going to begin. So when the fighting began on the Mongolian frontier, the Russians wanted to keep it quiet because they were trying to negotiate an agreement with Japan's ally, Germany. And so the Russians-Japanese problem was an embarrassment to them. The Japanese got smashed in this battle, and so they kept it quiet because they didn't want to advertise their defeat. So both the Russians and the Japanese had reasons to keep it quiet, and in the meantime, everyone else's eyes were focused on Poland and the coming of the war in Europe.
The Battle of Nomonhan between the Russians and the Japanese decided the outcome of World War II by adding both positive and negative attributes.